Bumble is back, both as our podcast sponsor and to help you find love. Honestly, dating can feel intimidating, but Bumble is definitely making it easier. Sometimes all you need is a different perspective or a little bit of guidance, which is exactly why Bumble has launched its new coaching hub. This update offers support and tips from experts, and my friends are loving it so far. For the love of love, give Bumble another shot. In 2023, a new movie became the center of a global media storm. The film spawned countless headlines, TikTok breakdowns, and blog posts, covering the goings-on behind the scenes of the film and the seemingly undeniable chemistry between its starring actors, before barely anyone had even seen it. The film was Anyone But You, starring Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell. From cozy pictures to flirtatious press tour interviews, the actors leaned so hard into their on-screen chemistry that it fueled off-screen romance rumors. While it was later revealed to be a PR stunt, it worked. What could have just been another rom-com quietly released into theaters instead became the highest-grossing romantic comedy in years. But Anyone But You wasn't just a financial success. The film's impact led to something bigger: the official return of the rom-com to the cultural mainstream. Whether it's a guilty pleasure or your favorite genre, everyone has sat down to watch a rom-com at one point or another. Sometimes it's with a group of friends, other times it might be in a theater, or if you're Gen Z, quite possibly through clips on TikTok. Over the years, countless quality rom-coms have been released, from Crazy Stupid Love to How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days to Clueless, cementing the rom-com as a formidable genre. But after the rom-com's popularity waned through the 2010s, Gen Z seems to be bringing the genre back. So why now? And what does this revival reveal about how young people see dating, romance, and relationships today? From Centennial World, I'm Lauren Meisner, and this is Infinite Scroll, a podcast about internet culture, the creator economy, and how social media is shaping Gen Z. Welcome back to Infinite Scroll, everyone. I'm so excited that Bumble is partnering with us on this extra deep dive for the month of October. We also have a new video editor, a new deep dive editor, Izzy. I'm so excited. I had to give the reins back to someone else after several months of doing it myself. You guys know I'm not a video editor, and I think the quality of editing, I think it showed. Anyways, as always, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. We are trying to get to 1,000 Spotify star ratings by the end of this year. And please sign up to our newsletter, which is called Keep Scrolling For. We publish 3 times a month on Fridays. Many of us may associate the rom-com with 90s or early 2000s pop culture, but this genre has been around far longer than that. Although identifying the first ever rom-com is a little tricky. Film has changed a lot over the years, from the media to the messaging, and so have the genres. But if we boil it down, there are some common characteristics across rom-coms and their various subgenres throughout history. Rom-coms are typically hopeful, carefree, or optimistic stories, exploring love and relationships through a specific couple and their experience. These couples may be in a slow burn relationship, experiencing the enemies to lovers arc, or it could be a love at first sight moment before being put to the test against various, often unusual obstacles. Whatever the trope, aspects of romance are juxtaposed against a comical or unserious plot. That's not to say that there aren't genuine lessons to be learned from these films. There definitely are, but they're often delivered in a more untraditional or indirect format. When reflecting on the history of rom-coms, many experts, commentators, and journalists point to It Happened One Night from 1934 as one of the first films to fall into this category. Specifically, this film was considered a screwball comedy, a subgenre of romantic comedies that gained popularity during the Great Depression. The plot of It Happened One Night sees an heiress fall in love with a struggling reporter, a scenario that would have been quite controversial and even humorous for the 1930s. The film went on to win the Big Five at the Academy Awards in 1934: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Writing. While screwball comedies were phased out by the late 1940s, this genre paved the way for other romantic comedies that followed similar themes and the style. In fact, upon the release of Anora last year, film critic Justin Chang Wang described this film as a, quote, contemporary return to screwball tradition, in a piece for The New Yorker. That being said, other film subgenres also came to define the rom-com as we know it. The next one worth discussing is sex comedies, as pointed out by Shanna Yellen in a piece for Glamour. These films often had the oh-so-common battle of the sexes element. Here, you may see two colleagues compete with one another before falling in love, or perhaps two characters who simply cannot stand one another. However, they eventually become entangled in a romantic relationship. Yellen notes that these sex comedies first gained popularity in the mid-20th century, attributing the shift towards this genre to the sexual revolution of the 1960s. As she explains, quote, the sexual research done by Alfred Kinsey opened up the conversation that women do have sex drives and engage in premarital sex. Playboy magazine came out in 1953, which gave men guides to developing relationships with women, and the industry's strict moral production code ended, and gave way to the rating system, which meant less censorship in films. All of these elements coming together could easily explain the momentum in the growth of sex comedies. Another key subgenre of the rom-com worth noting are neo-traditional romantic comedies. While these emerged later than sex comedies, they veered toward conservatism. Leisure Grindin, in his 2011 book The Hollywood Romantic Comedy: Conventions, History, Controversies, credited this move to a broader cultural change in the 80s, specifically the political ascendancy of conservative figures like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. These neo-traditional romantic comedies, like When Harry Met Sally or Notting Hill, lean into old-fashioned romantic tropes and messaging. As Grindin explains, quote, the reaffirmation of romance is a retreat from realism back to traditional genre conventions that create a nostalgic mood with reference to sentimental romantic dramas. Here, there is a classic formula. A stereotypical white man meets a stereotypical white woman, and problems are likely to follow before they end up falling in love. Often these women in films are seeking romance while striving for marriage. They are unlikely to be purely seeking a physical relationship. The de-emphasis of sex is central in the romantic comedies from this period, presenting women who are less interested in having sexual, physically fulfilling relationships than they are in forming an emotional connection with the one. Isabel Wright explains for the Her Story Project blog, the neo-traditional woman possesses a certain innocence and conservatism as she desires romance, a husband and family, just as much as, if not more than, individual success in life. Ultimately, while rom-coms may be dismissed as shallow or stupid chick flicks, which is very misogynistic, may I add, it is clear that the different eras of the rom-com align with the socio-political mood at the time. With that being said, you shouldn't be too quick to dismiss this genre and what it says about relationships and society at any given point. For many film buffs, the golden age of the rom-com was actually the 1990s. Some experts, like Scott Meslow, author of From Hollywood with Love, The Rise and Fall and Rise Again of the romantic comedy, note that When Harry Met Sally was the turning point. The 1990s saw some of the most iconic rom-coms ever released. I'm talking Pretty Woman, Groundhog Day, 10 Things I Hate About You, the list goes on. Quote, romantic comedies helped create careers, particularly among actresses, and much of the appeal of some of these films were recognizable faces on movie posters. Stars like Meg Ryan, Julia Roberts, and Hugh Grant would go on to have decades-long careers. Journalist Sam Hart writes for Reuters. This golden age stretched into the early 2000s. In fact, according to IMDb, the top 3 highest-grossing rom-coms were all released during this period. My Big Fat Greek Wedding in 2002 at number 1, What Women Want in 2000 at number 2, and Hitch in 2005, rounding out the top 3. During this era, millennials were the youth generation driving culture. Older millennials were entering adulthood, while younger millennials were living out their teens and tween years. Naturally, the rom-com's pop culture dominance was something this generation resonated with, for better or worse. Chelsea Fagan, CEO and co-founder of The Financial Diet, published a particularly interesting video essay on how millennial women were shaped by this genre.
Millennial women are in many ways in their rom-com era. They've basically never left it. But in general, most people would agree that the apex of the genre was somewhere between the early 90s and the late aughts, meaning that millennial women were at their most impressionable ages when they saw these movies, and by extension, learned these at minimum we can say pretty compromised lessons. We weren't adults going to see them with the critical distance of knowing that it's obviously a bit of a fairy tale, nor were we too young to not have absorbed them at all. We were at the peak ages where pop culture can mold and influence your understanding of the world around you and your expectations for yourself.
As Chelsea points out, rom-coms set a variety of expectations for millennial viewers. Expectations that often looked very different from real life. As she highlights in her video, many rom-com protagonists held mid-level white-collar jobs, yet somehow sustained extremely lavish lifestyles. This was a very dramatic contrast to the world that millennials entered after the 2008 global financial crisis. Meanwhile, other lessons from these films revolved around romance and gender roles, what to expect from relationships, and how to navigate them. Though many of these narratives may have been unrealistic, the rom-com resonated with millennials because of its inherent optimism. Hope defined the millennial upbringing. This generation was told that they could be anyone and do anything. It was shaped in part by the rise of feminism, growing LGBTQIA+ visibility, and later the optimism of the Obama era. This all led to a broader sense of progressivism and possibility among the youth generation. Having said that, it's not exactly surprising that the rom-com, an intrinsically hopeful genre, experienced its peak in an era defined by millennial optimism. However, it would only be a matter of time before the rom-com bubble burst. Throughout the 2010s, a shift occurred in the film industry. Rom-coms were no longer dominating culture, generating buzz, and bringing in nearly as much money as they once did. There were a couple of reasons for this. The first was the way film studios moved away from mid-budget movies. The 2010s were defined by films with huge budgets, spectacle, and franchises. The rise and popularity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe beginning in 2008 is a case in point. The shift toward action-packed blockbusters had unintended consequences for the romantic comedy. Many studios ended up investing in big-budget films because they were far more profitable than the mid-budget tier. Unfortunately, that's where many rom-coms sit. This was compounded by the rising cost of watching a movie in theaters and the growing popularity of streaming. Audiences were increasingly reserving theater visits for films that offer a markedly different experience on the big screen, waiting for the rest to become available via streaming. All of these factors contributed to the decline of the rom-com as we once knew it. There is also something to be said about the demise of monoculture, and in turn, the movie star. We often find ourselves reflecting on the monoculture era of pop culture on this podcast. But for those unfamiliar with the term, it was a time when pop culture was viewed through a single lens. It was completely monolithic. Music, films, and everything in between were entirely dictated by critics, award shows, and magazines. Monoculture has completely fractured in the digital era, a topic that we did discuss in our episode titled "Virality is Dead: How Doom Scrolling Killed Viral Content." This is due to a variety of factors, but perhaps most influential is the algorithm and the personalization of pop culture. The way we consume pop culture now means that everyone is essentially on their own side of the internet. We all have our own celebrities and influencers that are A-list to us, but no one else in our lives knows who they are. With the oversaturation of content, creators, and online personalities everywhere, the obsession and interest that might once have been reserved for movie stars have shifted toward more niche figures. We actually explored the decline of the traditional movie star in our recent edition of our Close Friends newsletter. And here's what I wrote. Quote, "Social media sealed the fate of the traditional movie star. Social media offers a direct connection to celebrities' personal lives. This blurs the lines between influencer and A-lister, with stars like Sydney Sweeney supplementing their careers through brand deals. At the same time, social media democratized fame. Anyone can build an audience, so being quote-unquote famous is no longer as rare or special." As we've touched on already, rom-coms launched many actresses to stardom. Julia Roberts, Meg Ryan, Sandra Bullock, and more. These starlets also brought in substantial profits for producers and studios. So if audiences no longer care as much about movie stars, it makes sense that the rom-com's influence would wane. Looking at the numbers is very telling. Take Pretty Woman, for example. This film was made with a budget of $14 million. Which is on the lower end of costs when it comes to Hollywood. It then went on to gross $463.4 million worldwide, at the time of its release in 1997. In a piece for CNN, journalist Leah Asmalash noticed how much things had changed by the 2010s. Quote, even as late as 2009, The Proposal, starring Sandra Bullock and Ryan Reynolds, was made on a budget of $40 million and grossed $317.3 million worldwide. But just 1 year before the smashing success of The Proposal, Fool's Gold, starring Kate Hudson and Matthew McConaughey, only grossed $111 million worldwide on a $70 million budget. Aside from financial factors, diversity also played a role in the rom-com's demise. Mainstream and studio-backed rom-coms were overwhelmingly straight and white. It should be noted that there was an entire universe highlighting Black romance and catering to Black audiences, but they rarely entered the mainstream like some other films that we have already mentioned. Unsurprisingly, this is likely due to racial biases. Nevertheless, some of the most popular films in this category included Brown Sugar from 2002, Love Jones from 1997, and Boomerang from 1992. This niche existed largely because conventional rom-coms rarely gave Black characters genuine character arcs or meaningful romantic connections. Many of the most popular rom-coms from the 90s and early 2000s relied on the Black woman as the funny best friend trope, which diluted both the character and the representation of Black women in mainstream media. Ultimately, many of these traditional films wrongfully taught audiences that romance, love, and relationships were reserved for white, heterosexual, conventionally attractive people. That got tired quickly, especially as more diverse perspectives began to gain virality and visibility in the mainstream media and online through social media platforms. All that being said, it is clear there are some problems with the genre, some of which led to its cultural demise. But Gen Z is seemingly yearning for a rom-com renaissance. Now, it's well established that Gen Z is a highly nostalgic generation, often using nostalgia as a coping mechanism. Growing up during the Trump era, COVID-19, the climate crisis, and witnessing the general rollback of minority rights has taken its toll on this demographic and their vision of the future. So it's not exactly surprising that this generation looks back on the content that their predecessors consumed with a sense of fondness, albeit to a point. We are not trying to excuse any problematic content here. Right now, though, we are seeing Gen Z's nostalgia reach new extremes, with many starting to romanticize 2016. That's right, only 9 years ago. The TikTok For You page is filled with content reminiscing and imagining about what it would have been like to be a teen in 2016. The era of the whip and the nay-nay, King Kylie, wire chokers, and the dog Snapchat filter. It's a somewhat odd fixation, especially given that many Gen Z members were actually teens or tweens at that time. Even though they were contributing to culture, 2016 was still an era largely driven by millennials. Therefore, you could make the claim that Gen Z isn't just feeling nostalgic for the 2016 aesthetic and vibes, but the optimism that underpinned millennial culture. Granted, the level of optimism had waned by this point, but not at all to the point that Gen Z is familiar with today. In comparison, those years often feel like simpler, less cynical times. In chasing that millennial optimism, even while labeling it cringe in the same breath, it makes sense that rom-coms would fall into this category. Unlike the fixation on 2016, a period that all Gen Z actually lived through, the renewed interest in the 90s and early 2000s rom-coms is especially interesting, since young people today did not experience dating during that period. The dating landscape has also shifted dramatically since then, particularly with the rise of online dating. You could put down the nostalgia around rom-coms to Gen Z's obsession with all things Y2K, but perhaps more powerful is the way that peak-era rom-coms function as a form of comfort, a throwback to watching them, often at too young an age, with friends, siblings, or family members. Though the stories in rom-coms don't fully reflect the realities of modern dating, they still provide a sense of familiarity. On top of this, it can also be fun for this generation to see themselves more directly in the genre they grew up watching. That said, we do have to note that nostalgia often relies on emotional vulnerability, and it can blur facts and reality. To be fair, that might just be the point. Many young audiences are seeking escapism from today's socio-political climate, but leaning too far into the nostalgia factor can still leave Gen Z with unrealistic or idealized expectations about love and romance, which isn't always healthy. While Gen Z has access to far more critical discourse about the media they consume than previous generations, they are definitely not immune to its influence. Ultimately, though, the Gen Z nostalgia for the rom-com makes sense. These films captured a cultural moment through love stories and romance, an era of optimism, relatability, and cinematic comfort that feels difficult to replicate today. But that doesn't mean that Hollywood isn't trying. They definitely are. Over the past few years, rom-coms have slowly been re-entering the zeitgeist. Between Netflix hits like To All the Boys I've Loved Before franchise and series like Bridgerton, the genre has found new life, especially on streaming platforms. But in 2023, Anyone But You marked the return of the rom-com to the mainstream. And as we mentioned in the intro, it was a triumphant return. As reported by Variety last year, quote, Anyone But You debuted in December with a soft $6 million, but managed to remain on box office charts into the new year. In that time, ticket sales have climbed to $86.5 million at the domestic box office and $112.8 million internationally. The film cost $25 million, so it's hugely profitable for Sony. And a reminder that rom-coms can be financially viable as a theatrical genre as long as budgets are kept in check. Since Anyone But You, several rom-coms have made their way back into theaters, namely The Idea of You and Fly Me to the Moon in 2024 and The Materialists in 2025. Between these films, some of the biggest actors in Hollywood have embraced the genre, including Pedro Pascal, Dakota Johnson, Scarlett Johansson, and Ryan Gosling, reaffirming that the rom-com renaissance is afoot. However, this era of the rom-com is obviously different from those of decades past. There are several reasons for this. First, there is a new audience to cater to. Hollywood is seemingly trying to capitalize on Gen Z's nostalgia for rom-coms and cater to them directly. For instance, many of the newly released rom-coms blend classic tropes with modern sensibilities, such as online dating and social media. But of course, whether they do this successfully is a separate question altogether. From a demographic standpoint, it makes perfect sense for Hollywood to engage with this new era of relationships, dating, and romance. Using US data as a case study, the largest group of single people are under 30, which isn't exactly surprising. As the Pew Research Center notes, quote, 47% of adults under 30 are single, compared with smaller shares of those ages 30 to 49, ages 50 to 64, and 65 and older. With most millennials now falling into the 30-plus bracket, it benefits Hollywood to reorient the rom-com toward Gen Z, who dominate today's dating landscape. That's not to say that millennials can't enjoy this new era of the rom-com, but rather that Gen Z represents an increasingly valuable audience to capture. As we've already noted, the genre's quote-unquote golden age was overwhelmingly white and heteronormative. More recent rom-coms, however, have started to change that, featuring more diverse casts and queer love stories, while moving away from the traditional plotlines of the past. One of the most famous examples of this shift is Crazy Rich Asians. Released in 2018, it was a big-budget romantic comedy that placed Asian actors in leading non-stereotypical roles within the English-speaking market. While there had been Asian-led films before, such as The Joy Luck Club, none had been quite this mainstream. There has also been a wave of rom-coms over the past decade that reflect the queer experience. Love, Simon from 2018 is often cited as a turning point, as it was the first mainstream studio romantic comedy told from the perspective of a gay teenager. Happiest Season from 2020 was another milestone, being the first lesbian Christmas rom-com produced by a major Hollywood studio. Of course, neither of these was the first queer rom-com by any means. I'm a Cheerleader, for instance, is an iconic cult classic that was released decades before, back in 1999. The key differences in this new era of queer rom-coms is that they are becoming increasingly mainstream and are supported by major industry players. The queer rom-coms today also exhibit more diversity. Earlier this year, for example, GQ declared that we're, quote, in the season of queer Asian rom-coms, with the release of films like The Wedding Banquet and A Nice Indian Boy over the course of 2025. Ultimately, these changes not only reflect the shifts in Hollywood that have gone down since the rom-com's golden age, but also the importance of diversity to a generation that has grown up on social media, constantly being fed content that directly reflects them and their life experiences. But modern rom-coms are not just an expanding genre. It is changing how these films are being marketed. In a piece for The Conversation, academic Christina Wilkins points to the rise of the male rom-com. From her perspective, the male rom-com is an attempt to inject some masculinity into the rom-com, seeking to move this genre away from its chick flick label. In her piece, she points to films like Hitman and The Fall Guy as examples. Wilkins claims that, quote, these films are not marketed as romantic comedies, but as action or comedies, even though romance is still central to the plot. Hitman and The Fall Guy are examples of what I would call a male rom-com. They ostensibly bear the same traits as a rom-com, but their stories are told through a more masculine lens, she explains. Interestingly, Wilkins also notes a significant quote-unquote gulf between critic and audience reviews when comparing the male rom-com to more conventional formats like Anyone But You. In her research, she found a 5-point difference between the average critic and audience ratings on Rotten Tomatoes for both Hitman and The Fall Guy, with scores sitting in the 90s and 80s respectively. Meanwhile, Anyone But You had an average audience rating of 87% compared to just 53% among critics. Quote, there is more of a critical bias towards films marketed at women, and therefore a likelihood of it being deemed of lower quality. And despite the male-fronted and marketed films, including elements of the rom-com, they are framed through the more masculine action genre, she reflects. It is perhaps unsurprising that critics tend to favor the male-centric approach. After all, media historically treats anything associated with women's interests as frivolous. But as Wilkins continues, quote, the success of these male rom-coms suggests that the romance genre can work, and even garner critical acclaim if given a more masculine sheen. But it's still the traditional rom-com that pulls in audiences. There's a lot to say about how Gen Z is spearheading the return of the rom-com. Much of it is rooted in nostalgia, as we've already discussed. But it goes further than just watching old childhood favorites. The resurgence of the rom-com says a lot about how Gen Z feels about the current dating scene. Gen Z has grown up in a very different time than their parents, and even older siblings, when it comes to dating and relationships. Often, the examples of romance they've seen, whether in media or in real life, feels worlds apart from their own reality. There's no question about how this can be demoralizing. And the return of the rom-com, with its inherently optimistic and hopeful take on love and relationships, suggests that Gen Z may be yearning for these deep emotional experiences and relationships themselves, even while navigating situationships and casual dating. Gen Z are not just watching these films for the story. They're locked in because of the nostalgia and a sense of hope. These films can be a chance to see relationships that feel honest and emotionally intentional, even if they are fictional. Research from Bumble's For the Love of Love campaign, which celebrates the hopeful side of modern dating, reinforces this idea. According to Bumble, 43% of daters say love means being seen for who they really are, and 40% say it's about feeling emotionally safe and understood. With a plurality prioritizing authenticity and clear intentions, Gen Z clearly hopes to show up authentically while dating and building relationships. Dating apps play a big role in this pursuit, as they're one of the main ways, if not the main way, that Gen Z navigates romance and relationships. As I mentioned in the ad read at the top of the episode, these platforms have even started offering practical support. For example, Bumble has recently rolled out algorithmic improvements to help users find a match that suits them, and its coaching hub provides guidance and expert tips for anyone navigating the dating world, whether they're new to apps or starting fresh. New rollouts and features like these have proven to be successful with young daters, with 55% of daters believing dating apps can lead to real love, according to Bumble. Overall, for a generation often labeled pessimistic or cynical, for good reason, the return of the rom-com might be a rare sign of optimism within this demographic. As we have established by this point, these films tap into a multitude of factors: nostalgia, hope, and the desire for connection. It suggests that even in a complicated dating landscape, and world, to be honest, Gen Z are looking for love and comedy to get through it all. Of course, the genre isn't perfect, and it is constantly evolving. But for a generation navigating political chaos, burnout, and just general uncertainty, finding a sense of hope and fun is important, even if it's just at the movies. Infinite Scroll is a podcast produced, presented, and co-written by me, Lauren Meisner, for Centennial World. This episode was researched and co-written by Annabelle Ben-David. Editing is by Izzy Phillips. Thank you so much for listening. I love you guys, and I will talk to you next week. Bye.